right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling strategic management.
Yeah, and we've got a mountain of sources here.
Textbook chapters, case studies, industry analysis, the whole shebang.
It's going to be a wild ride, but super insightful, I think.
Definitely. So, what's jumped out at you so far?
Well, one thing that really struck me is how much emphasis all these sources put on the external environment of a business.
Like, it's not enough to just have an amazing product, right?
Right. You got to know the market, the competition, all the forces at play, basically.
It's like even the best idea can tank if you haven't really tested if the world's ready for it.
Absolutely. And one source lays out this classic 5-stage process for strategic management. And understanding the external environment is woven through the entire thing.
Okay, break it down for me. What are those 5 stages?
First, you develop a vision and mission. Then you set specific objectives, craft a strategy to actually reach those objectives, implement the strategy, and finally, you evaluate the results.
Sounds pretty straightforward. But where does the whole research and hypothesis testing thing come in?
Well, what's interesting is that research and hypothesis testing, they inform every single stage. Each of those stages, you're forming hypotheses and then testing them.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example. How would that work in practice?
Let's say your objective is to launch a brand new product line.
Okay, exciting.
Your hypothesis might be, there's a strong market demand for this kind of product. But then you'd need to do some serious market research to test that hypothesis.
So, figuring out if there's really a need for this product, right?
Exactly. Who are your target customers? What do they actually need and want? How much are they willing to pay? Research can help answer all of that.
And what if the research shows there isn't enough demand?
Then you either adjust the product, find a different target market, or maybe, scrap the whole idea. It's all about minimizing risk by getting the data before you make a big investment.
Makes sense. You don't want to jump in headfirst without knowing what you're diving into.
Right. And speaking of data, one of the sources really dives deep on financial ratios. Things like price-earnings ratio, dividend payout ratio, all these numbers that can tell you a lot about a company's health and whether they're attractive to investors.
Oh, you're speaking my language. I love a good data deep dive. But how does this tie back to testing hypotheses?
Let's say you're thinking about acquiring another company.
Okay, big move.
Your hypothesis might be that this acquisition is going to create significant value for your shareholders.
Right, got to keep those shareholders happy.
But before you jump in, you need to dig into their financials, right?
Yeah.
Are they truly profitable? Do they have a sustainable business model? Are there any hidden liabilities lurking beneath the surface?
So it's like using data to either confirm your gut feeling or realize maybe your gut was leading you astray.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And one of the sources uses Nordstrom as a case study to really highlight this point.
Oh, Nordstrom, the department store.
Yep, exactly. Their objective was to increase credit revenue, but they didn't just assume that offering more credit cards would automatically do that.
So they had a hypothesis, but what did they do to test it?
They did a ton of customer research. They looked at shopping patterns, spending habits, demographics, you name it.
Sounds thorough.
What they found was that their most loyal customers, the ones who shop there the most, they already had Nordstrom credit cards.
So just offering more cards wasn't going to move the needle because the people most likely to use them were already on board.
Exactly. So Nordstrom had to shift their strategy. Instead of focusing on getting new credit customers, they focused on rewarding their existing cardholders.
Smart move. Keep the loyal customers happy.
They gave them exclusive perks, benefits, that kind of thing. And this approach, based on what they learned from the data, was way more successful.
See, that's a brilliant example of how research can lead to a much more targeted and effective strategy. It's not just about gathering the data, it's about using it to challenge your assumptions and then refine your approach.
100%. And sometimes those insights can lead to some unexpected pivots. Remember Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac?
Oh, yeah. Those government-sponsored mortgage giants that kind of imploded during the financial crisis? Yeah, that story still makes me shudder a little bit.
Right. One of the sources points to them as a cautionary tale. Now, while their collapse had a lot of factors involved, a lack of, proper due diligence and data analysis played a big role.
So they had a hypothesis about the housing market, but they didn't really test it, did they?
Well, essentially, their hypothesis was that the housing market would just keep going up, up, up forever, and they based their lending practices on that assumption.
Which obviously didn't pan out so well.
Right. If they had, really analyzed the data more rigorously, they would have seen those warning signs. The housing bubble, the subprime mortgages, the lax lending standards, it was all there.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? You have to constantly question your assumptions and seek out data that might challenge your beliefs, even, or maybe especially, when those beliefs seem rock solid. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about going global. One of the sources dives into how businesses approach international expansion, and it seems like testing hypotheses in a global context adds like a whole other layer of complexity.
Absolutely. Entering a new market, especially in a different country, it's full of uncertainty. You might have a hypothesis based on your success in your home market, but cultural differences, local regulations, the competitive landscape, all those things can make a huge difference.
So give me an example. How would a business go about testing a hypothesis about entering a new international market?
Okay, let's say you're a clothing retailer. You've got a strong online presence here in the US, and you're thinking about expanding into, say, Japan.
Okay, fashionable clothes going to Japan. I can see it.
Your hypothesis might be, our brand is going to resonate with Japanese consumers because of its focus on sustainability and ethical sourcing.
Sounds like a good hypothesis, but
But you can't just assume that those values are going to translate directly. You need to do your research.
what kind of research would they need to do?
First off, they'd need to understand the Japanese consumer market, their preferences, their buying habits, those cultural nuances.
So, like, do they actually care about sustainability?
Right. And what are their price points? What are the dominant distribution channels over there? That kind of thing.
And then they'd need to look at the competitive landscape, right?
For sure. Who are the big players in the Japanese clothing market? What are their strengths and weaknesses?
It sounds like going global involves testing a whole web of interconnected hypotheses. And it's not just a one-time thing, right? You got to keep testing and adapting as you go.
You got it. The most successful global businesses are constantly testing, learning, and adapting. They see every market entry as an experiment.
That makes sense.
They gather data, analyze the results, and then refine their approach based on what they learn. They're not afraid to pivot or even pull out entirely if the data shows their initial hypotheses were wrong.
This is making me realize how every business decision, whether it's big or small, is basically a gamble. And the more you can stack the odds in your favor with data and research, the better your chances of winning.
That's a powerful way to think about it. And speaking of stacking the odds, let's talk about strategic alliances.
Ooh, partnerships. Those can be incredibly valuable, but I imagine they also involve a certain amount of risk.
You're telling me. You're essentially betting on the success of another company as well as your own. So when you're forming an alliance, you're basically testing a hypothesis
About
about the potential for synergy and mutual benefit. Will this partnership really allow us to achieve something greater together than we could on our own? That's the big question.
what are some of the questions businesses should be asking themselves before jumping into an alliance?
Well, first and foremost, do our goals actually align? Are we both truly committed to the same vision for this partnership?
Yeah, that seems pretty fundamental.
It's crucial to be clear about each other's motivations and expectations from the get-go. And beyond just aligning on goals, you also need to look at the practical aspects of collaboration.
Right, like, can we actually work together effectively?
Exactly. You need to assess whether your capabilities and resources truly complement each other. Do we bring different strengths to the table? Can we leverage each other's expertise and networks?
And of course, you'd want to look at their track record.
I got it. Have they been successful in past alliances? Are they known for being reliable, trustworthy partners? All important things to consider.
So a strategic alliance shouldn't be a leap of faith. It should be a calculated decision based on careful analysis and a shared understanding of the potential benefits and risks involved.
Exactly. No blind leaps.
This has been fantastic so far. I feel like we've covered so much ground, and it's really got my brain firing on all cylinders.
I know, right? And we're just getting started. There's a ton more to unpack.
We were just diving into strategic alliances and how they're all about finding the right partners.
Yeah, to achieve those shared goals, right?
But what about when going it alone makes more sense? One source mentions vertical integration.
Ah, vertical integration.
What's the hypothesis there?
It's all about gaining more control over different parts of your supply chain.
Okay, so like instead of relying on outside suppliers or distributors,
You bring those functions in-house. The hypothesis is that owning more of the process will give you a competitive edge.
so you're saying if we control more, we can either lower costs or create a product that's truly unique.
Exactly. But the source is careful to point out that this isn't always a guaranteed win.
There are downsides.
Definitely trade-offs. Like one example that stuck with me was companies trying to vertically integrate by manufacturing their own parts.
Seems intuitive, right? Do it yourself, it's cheaper.
But that's not always the case. Those specialized suppliers, they've often achieved massive economies of scale.
So it's hard to compete on cost.
Exactly. And it's not just about cost either. You need to consider if you even have the know-how to manage those new operations well.
Taking on more responsibility can backfire if you're not ready for it.
100%. So vertical integration, proceed with caution.
Got it. Now, shifting gears a bit, one source dives into the concept of core competencies. What a company does really, really well.
Ah, yes. Those core competencies.
What's the connection to hypothesis testing here?
Well, every business needs to figure out what they excel at and then test hypotheses about how to leverage those strengths. The source outlines 3 main approaches.
Okay, mommy.
Developing those competencies internally, acquiring them through mergers, or accessing them through, you guessed it, strategic alliances.
Ah, so it all ties back together.
It does. So you're saying we're awesome at X. Now how can we use X to grow, to innovate, to enter a new market?
Precisely. And each approach involves testing a different set of hypotheses.
Right. If you're developing competencies internally, your hypothesis might be, we can build this expertise through investments in R&D or by bringing in top talent.
But that takes time, resources.
It does. You're essentially betting that the long-term payoff will justify that upfront investment.
And if you go the acquisition route,
Then you're testing a hypothesis about whether integrating another company's capabilities will really enhance your own.
mergers and acquisitions, though, those can be risky, right?
You can. It's like 2 puzzle pieces that look like they fit but actually don't. That's why thorough due diligence is so important.
You really got to do your homework.
You're testing hypotheses about cultural compatibility, financial viability, and the potential for synergy. Will this acquisition actually create value, or is it just a distraction?
And then there's the alliance route, which we already talked about.
Yeah.
Finding partners who can fill those gaps.
Exactly. And this leads to another essential tool that the sources mention, the SWOT analysis.
Ah, yes, the classic SWOT analysis. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's like taking a big picture snapshot of where your company stands.
Right, and where it might be headed. But the SWOT analysis isn't just a static list. It's a jumping-off point for generating and testing hypotheses about how to address those weaknesses, how to capitalize on your strengths, and how to navigate the ever-changing landscape of opportunities and threats.
So you might say, our weakness is low brand awareness. Our hypothesis is that launching a targeted marketing campaign will boost awareness and drive sales. Then you track the data to see if you're right.
Exactly. Or you might identify a threat, like a new competitor entering your market.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And your hypothesis might be, we can differentiate ourselves through awesome customer service and build loyalty that way. Again, it's all about using research and data to either validate or refine your approach.
This is really making me rethink how businesses approach decision-making. It's not about gut feelings. It's about testing, gathering data, and constantly adapting based on what you learn.
You got it. Strategic management, it's way more dynamic than people think. It's not just about setting a plan and sticking to it no matter what.
It's about staying flexible.
You have to constantly adapt and evolve. And that brings us to another important concept from the sources, strategic offensives.
Offensives, like going on the attack.
Sometimes you need to make bold moves to shake things up and gain that competitive advantage.
So playing it safe isn't always enough. You got to be willing to disrupt the status quo and take calculated risks.
Exactly. But those risks should still be grounded in solid hypotheses and data-driven insights.
Not just being reckless.
Right. A successful offensive is about making strategic moves that are designed to create lasting advantages.
One example that jumps to mind is Apple's launch of the iPhone. They completely disrupted the mobile phone industry with a product that was unlike anything else on the market.
Perfect example. Their hypothesis was that consumers were ready for a smartphone that was more intuitive, more powerful, and more stylish than anything else out there.
And they were right. The iPhone was a game changer.
It was. But they didn't just launch a product and hope for the best. They invested heavily in research and development. They carefully crafted their marketing message, and they built a whole ecosystem of apps and services to enhance the user experience.
They really thought it through.
They were taking a calculated risk, but it was a risk based on deep insights into consumer needs and technology trends. And that's what set them apart.
So smart. This deep dive is really making me see how important it is to challenge those assumptions and to really look at the data.
It's all about making informed decisions, right? And a key part of adapting is having the right organizational structure in place.
Oh, right, the structure of the company itself.
One source digs into different types, highlighting how that choice can make or break your ability to execute your strategy.
So you can have a great strategy, but if your organizational structure is a mess, you're going to struggle.
You're going to struggle big time. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The best structure depends on a company's size, industry, competitive strategy, all sorts of factors.
So how do you choose the right structure?
It's all about testing hypotheses, too. You need to think about what structure will best support your goals and allow your teams to really work effectively.
Do you need a super centralized structure or a more decentralized structure that gives employees more freedom? That's a big question.
It is. Finding the right balance is key. Too much centralization can stifle innovation, but too much decentralization can lead to chaos.
It's a delicate dance.
It is, and it's not just about the structure itself, it's about how you implement and manage it. You need clear roles and responsibilities, good communication, and a culture that encourages collaboration.
Speaking of culture, one source really emphasizes its importance.
Culture is huge. It can either be a driving force or a major roadblock.
How so?
Culture is often that invisible force that shapes behavior within an organization. It's the shared values, beliefs, and norms that guide how people interact and make decisions. And when a company's culture is aligned with its strategy, it can be a huge advantage.
But when culture and strategy are at odds,
That's when things can go sideways. If your strategy requires agility and innovation, but your culture is all about risk aversion and bureaucracy, you're going to face a lot of pushback.
makes sense.
Leaders need to be deliberate about shaping a culture that supports their strategic goals.
So you can't just talk about values. You actually have to live them.
Exactly. And that's where hypothesis testing comes in again. You might have a hypothesis that introducing a new performance management system will create a more collaborative culture.
So you implement the new system, you track the data, and you see if it actually changes things for the better. It's all connected.
It all comes back around. And another key part of culture is having the right people in the right roles.
The human element.
Exactly. One source talks about the importance of recruiting, training, and retaining talented employees who share your company's values.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Building a strong, supportive culture is an ongoing process. It takes constant attention and effort.
But it sounds like it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely. When you have engaged, motivated employees who believe in what you're doing, that's when the magic happens.
This deep dive has been a goldmine of insights. I feel like my brain is bursting with new ideas.
I know, right? And we've only scratched the surface.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered about how businesses use hypotheses to make better decisions.
Right. And it's not just for huge corporations either.
It's across the board. One thing that's really struck me is the sheer variety of companies in these sources. We've got tech giants, retail giants.
Yeah. And even more niche players too.
Exactly. Like Herman Miller, they make furniture, right?
Yeah. And J.M. Smucker, the jam and jelly people. It's fascinating.
It really highlights how these core principles of strategic management, they apply to pretty much any business, right?
Absolutely. Whether you're a tiny startup or a massive multinational company, these principles matter.
I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners. Don't be afraid to learn from other companies and industries. Even if they seem completely different from yours, there's always something to learn.
Always. There's this great example in one of the sources about Toyota.
Toyota, the car company.
Yep. They launched their Lexus line. They basically took their expertise in making high-quality but affordable cars.
Right.
And they applied it to the luxury car market.
Who would have thought that would work?
It's a classic example of a company leveraging their core competencies to, break into a new market. They didn't reinvent the wheel, they just adapted to a new context.
And they tested a hypothesis that a luxury car buyer would be open to a Toyota product. Turns out they were right.
Lexus became a major player. It just goes to show sometimes the best innovations come from taking what you already do well and finding new ways to use it. And of course, testing if your hunch is right.
It's like that Picasso quote, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal."
Exactly.
He wasn't talking about actual stealing, of course. He meant being inspired by others, building on their ideas.
In the business world, it's about paying attention to what others are doing. Learning from their wins and their losses, not being afraid to adapt those ideas that might work for you.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked a lot about data-driven decision-making and how important that is.
Yeah.
But these sources also really emphasize that business is about people,
Yeah.
too. Sometimes we get so caught up in the numbers that we forget that.
So true. You can have all the data in the world, but if you don't have the right team, the right culture, and leaders who inspire, well, the data won't get you very far.
One source put it this way: adding talent and building intellectual capital is often more important than investing in, like, physical projects.
That really sums it up. Yes, you need capital to grow, but it's the people who actually make things happen. Their creativity, their passion, their hard work, that's what turns a good strategy into a great company.
So here's my final question for everyone listening.
Yeah.
Are you investing enough in your people? Are you creating a culture where they can do their best work? Because at the end of the day, they're your most valuable asset.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable.
And until next time.